The broadcast began with the weight of inevitability, a voice layered with artificial resonance, carrying across every receiver in human space. It was not a request, not a negotiation, it was command. The Galactic Empire, stretching across the stars with legions of species bound in servitude, demanded that the upstart Terran worlds kneel. The words were simple, yet they cut with finality: disarm immediately, dissolve the fleets, surrender all colonies outside Sol, and accept subjugation beneath the imperial throne. Non-compliance, they promised, would result in eradication. The message was draped in ceremonial grandeur, designed to impress upon lesser civilizations the futility of defiance. Banners of alien glyphs floated across the projection, and the voice recited the Empire's long history of conquest, presenting obedience as a gift rather than a shackle. The ultimatum closed with silence, a silence that spoke more loudly than the threats, an assurance that resistance would be short, decisive, and final. For centuries, the Galactic Empire had ruled uncontested. Entire civilizations, advanced in their own right, had bent without a struggle, preferring survival under the banner of the throne rather than the annihilation that awaited the disobedient. Species older and more numerous than humankind had resigned themselves to vassalage, their fleets dismantled, their cultures stripped of autonomy. Against such a backdrop, the expectation was clear: Terrans, with only a few decades of interstellar presence, would obey as all before them had obeyed. Yet, even as the ultimatum echoed across human systems, the reaction it sparked was not resignation. On Mars, colonists gathering in the domes watched the broadcast with clenched jaws, their reflections hard in the glass as the alien symbols scrolled by. On Europa, workers paused in ice-carved corridors, listening as the voice declared their future chains. On Earth itself, in crowded cities still scarred by humanity's own turbulent history, people stared at the screens not with fear, but with recognition. This was tyranny, familiar in every age, wearing a new mask. The Empire thought it spoke to a divided, insecure species. What it failed to grasp was the deep, unyielding scar tissue humanity bore from its own history. Empires had risen and fallen on Earth long before Terrans reached the stars, and every attempt at domination had been met by rebellion, insurgency, or outright war. Humanity had endured total wars, genocides, the shattering of continents, and still clawed its way forward. The Galactic Empire's ultimatum, rather than intimidating, echoed the proclamations of despots past. It was a tone humanity had heard before, and it lit a fire of defiance. The Empire also misjudged the Terran perception of weakness. Humans were not blind to the odds. They knew their fleets were dwarfed by the sheer scale of imperial armadas, their colonies outnumbered 100-fold. But humanity had always thrived in uneven struggles. It was not parity that drove them, but necessity. When cornered, they adapted; when outmatched, they innovated; when threatened with erasure, they refused to vanish quietly. The ultimatum did not inspire fear, it forced clarity. Within hours, the ultimatum had been replayed across every corner of Terran space. News networks dissected each phrase, military analysts measured the scale of the threat, philosophers debated the ethics of resistance versus submission. But beneath the analysis, one truth rang clear: in households, in factories, in barracks, to submit would be to cease being human. Survival at the cost of freedom was not survival, it was extinction in another form. The Galactic Empire's message, designed to extinguish resistance before it began, had the opposite effect. In its arrogance, it unified the human frontier in a way decades of politics had not achieved. Bitter disputes between Terran factions were suddenly irrelevant. Colonies that once competed for resources now spoke of solidarity. For the first time in living memory, humanity's myriad voices began to align, not through coercion, but through choice. The words, "surrender or be destroyed," might have cowed other species, but to Terrans it carried a different weight. Humanity had already faced the abyss many times, whether in the form of nuclear fire, plagues, or ecological collapse. The threat of destruction was not new, it was something every generation had lived under in one form or another. If the choice was slavery or death, humanity had already rehearsed the answer throughout its history. The ultimatum was intended to be the Empire's opening move, a masterstroke of psychological dominance. Instead, it became the spark of a story the throne could not anticipate. Across the colonies, men and women listened, digested, and silently resolved. They did not yet know the price that would be demanded, nor the scale of the war looming, but instinct guided them toward the same conclusion: humanity would not kneel. The Empire had miscalculated. They saw a fragile species with scattered colonies. What they failed to recognize was that in threatening humanity with annihilation, they had awakened the very trait that no empire had ever successfully broken: the refusal of Terrans to submit, no matter the odds. And in that refusal, the seeds of the Empire's undoing were sown. The ultimatum reached the Terran Council within minutes, and by the hour's end, the chamber was filled with a storm of voices. Generals argued raw numbers, pointing out the scale of Imperial fleets compared to the small but growing Terran navy. Economists cited the catastrophic consequences of refusing: the annihilation of trade, the destruction of colonies painstakingly carved from hostile worlds. Philosophers and statesmen pressed the moral weight of submission, warning that compliance would mean the slow suffocation of human identity. For every plea of caution, another voice rose, unflinching, to insist that humanity had not crossed the void to bow to another master. The debate was fierce but not fractured. Beneath the shouting and the calculations lay a shared truth: humanity's character had never bent easily. The question was not whether they should resist, but how long they could endure. Some called for negotiation, others for immediate mobilization, but even the most pragmatic of voices hesitated to suggest surrender outright. The message had been clear: submission meant disarmament, servitude, and the end of independent destiny. To obey would not preserve humanity, it would erase it. When the council finally adjourned, no one left with illusions of safety. Every delegate carried the same unspoken decision: resistance was no longer a matter of choice, it was a matter of survival with dignity intact. The Terran Council's defiance did not manifest in cheers or celebration, but in a grim, silent agreement that humanity would fight, however impossible the odds. The rejection of the ultimatum rippled across every corner of human space. Colonists on Mars broadcast fiery messages of solidarity, miners on Titan pledged their labor for the war effort, and engineers on Luna began accelerating ship production with a fervor that bordered on obsession. Factories that once built tools for exploration converted overnight to the forging of weapons. Civilian freighters were stripped and armored, turned into makeshift gunships. The hum of industry deepened across every colony as humanity shifted its entire civilization toward the machinery of defiance. Ordinary people, far from the chambers of power, made the choice to resist in quieter but no less vital ways. Farmers pledged food to sustain soldiers, students enlisted in academies, and scientists abandoned peacetime projects to refine weapons, shields, and stealth systems. The collective mood was neither despair nor reckless bravado. It was grim determination. Every individual, from asteroid miner to admiral, understood they were standing on the edge of extinction. And yet, facing annihilation, they chose action over submission. The Galactic Empire had expected humanity to fracture under pressure, to reveal the divisions that so often plagued new civilizations. Instead, their demand for surrender united factions that had quarreled for generations. Old rivalries between colonies were set aside overnight. Where once arguments had flared over trade routes or resource rights, voices now declared a common cause. Leaders who had been political adversaries shook hands with iron resolve, swearing loyalty not to a party or planet, but to the survival of the Terran spirit. It was in this climate that the rejection message was drafted. The speech was direct, almost austere in its wording. Humanity would not dissolve its fleets, would not abandon its colonies, would not submit to any throne. The declaration did not attempt to bluster or threaten, for the Council knew they could not rival the Empire in scale. Instead, the words carried an iron certainty. Terrans would resist with everything they possessed, and if crushed, they would fall as free beings rather than live as slaves. When the response was broadcast back across the stars, it was not the grandeur of the language that startled observers, but the conviction behind it. Other species, long cowed into submission, heard something in humanity's tone that had been absent for centuries, a refusal spoken without hesitation, a rejection of inevitability. Among those who had lived under the Empire's yoke for generations, whispers began to spread that perhaps these humans were not fools, but heralds of something the galaxy had long forgotten. For the Empire, the defiance was an irritation, another minor species choosing its own destruction. For humanity, it was the first moment of true unity on the interstellar stage. The Terran Council had spoken, but more importantly, the people themselves had embraced the decision. It was not a single leader's command, not the ambition of a warlord, but the collective will of billions who chose to stand rather than kneel. That choice would define every step to come. Humanity's fleets were small, its colonies scattered, and its technology young compared to the ancient power arrayed against them. Yet in the face of that vast disparity, the rejection of the ultimatum marked a shift that could not be undone. The Empire had demanded obedience and expected fear. Instead, it had summoned defiance that burned brighter with every world that listened. The message was simple, stripped of all ceremony: humanity would not bow. The Empire moved swiftly, confident that the Terran defiance would last no longer than a single campaign. Massive fleets assembled at the border of human space, their sheer numbers dwarfing every vessel humanity had launched into the void. For centuries these fleets had been the ultimate symbol of inevitability, a hammer that broke any resistance before it could spread. Against such a force, the expectation was that Terran colonies would collapse like glass beneath steel. Yet the opening strikes revealed something the Empire had not accounted for: humans did not fight as others fought. The first clashes were brutal. Outer colonies bore the brunt of the Empire's assault, with defenses crumbling under barrages of weapons far beyond anything humanity had faced before. Entire populations were displaced overnight, and fleets scrambled to mount desperate retreats. But the withdrawals were not aimless. Each loss, each skirmish, was studied with meticulous attention. Terran commanders refused to mirror the Empire's rigid doctrines; they improvised. Where the Empire sought decisive battles, humans bled them with ambushes, hit-and-run strikes, and maneuvers so unorthodox they appeared reckless, until they worked. Imperial admirals prided themselves on flawless formations, perfected over centuries of conquest. To them, discipline was strength. Humanity turned that strength into a liability. Raiding squadrons struck at supply lines and disappeared before counterattacks arrived. Small ships darted into the gaps between massive war engines, exploiting blind spots their designers had never considered. Civilian craft retrofitted with crude weaponry harassed convoys, buying time for heavier vessels to regroup. Every Terran loss inflicted pain, but every Imperial misstep was magnified by human audacity. The cost was staggering. Colonies burned, and families were scattered across the stars. Yet with each act of defiance, morale hardened instead of fracturing. Reports of successful ambushes, of smaller fleets crippling massive Imperial detachments, circulated like lifelines through the embattled populace. Soldiers who should have been crushed by despair began to fight with a fierceness that stunned their adversaries. They were not defending territory alone; they were defending the principle that their species would not be erased. One particular victory became legend among the fleets. A Terran task force, outnumbered and outgunned, drew an Imperial armada into a narrow region of unstable space. Using precise calculations and sheer daring, they detonated charges that destabilized the region's gravity wells. In the chaos, Imperial ships collided, tore apart, and became easy prey for the smaller, more maneuverable Terran craft. When the smoke cleared, the humans had destroyed a force several times their size. Strategically, it was only a modest reprieve, but symbolically it was a thunderclap. Humanity could not only resist, they could win. Imperial commanders grew frustrated. Each engagement, expected to be a swift suppression, stretched into grueling campaigns. The Empire's strength had always relied on overwhelming force applied swiftly, but the Terrans dragged them into drawn-out contests of endurance. This was a battle rhythm the Empire had not trained for, and its admirals struggled to adapt. Their enemies were supposed to fear annihilation; instead, humans seemed to draw power from it, fighting harder the closer they came to destruction. The psychological impact reverberated across both sides. For the Empire, the illusion of inevitability cracked. Subjugated species, long resigned to submission, watched in astonishment as humanity inflicted wounds on the untouchable juggernaut. For the Terrans, each victory, however costly, proved that survival was possible. Even in retreat, they carried themselves with the knowledge that their defiance had substance, that their refusal to kneel was more than symbolic. The war effort transformed the identity of humanity itself. No longer were they fledgling explorers testing their place among the stars. They were warriors forged in fire, crafting strategies and technologies in the crucible of necessity. Every shipyard worked without rest, every scientist pushed boundaries, and every soldier entered battle with the knowledge that their stand was shaping not only their future but the destiny of countless others watching from the shadows. By the time the Empire realized the scope of its miscalculation, the damage had already been done. The humans had endured the first storms and, in surviving, had robbed the Empire of its greatest weapon, certainty. The ultimatum that had been meant to crush their spirit had instead created a war where determination outweighed numbers. Humanity had transformed the narrative from inevitable defeat to defiant struggle. And within that struggle, the seeds of reversal were beginning to take root. The war no longer resembled the Empire's expectations. What had begun as a campaign of suppression turned into a contest of endurance, and within that shift humanity discovered its advantage. Every setback became instruction, every defeat a foundation for adaptation. Where imperial doctrine demanded rigid adherence to ancient tactics, Terrans thrived in improvisation. Their commanders adjusted on the fly, revising strategies mid-battle in ways that left imperial officers bewildered. This constant evolution denied the Empire the comfort of predictability. The first sign of a true turning point emerged not from sheer force, but from innovation born of desperation. Human engineers, given access to the wreckage of captured imperial vessels, learned quickly. Within weeks, they integrated unfamiliar technology into their own ships, splicing alien systems with human design. What should have taken decades of research was accelerated by necessity, producing weapons and countermeasures that surprised even their creators. Imperial fleets accustomed to facing lesser civilizations found themselves confronted with enemies who adapted between engagements, neutralizing advantages once considered permanent. These advances were not merely technical. They reflected a culture willing to experiment recklessly, to risk failure repeatedly until success emerged. Where the Empire saw failure as weakness, humanity saw it as process. That difference reshaped the war. Human fleets began fielding unconventional hybrids, awkward but effective, and deployed tactics that seemed chaotic until their results became undeniable. Battles once defined by overwhelming imperial superiority now carried uncertainty, with Terrans carving victories through ingenuity. The psychological consequences rippled across the galaxy. Races that had long resigned themselves to imperial chains began to watch closely. For generations, rebellion had been unthinkable. The memory of crushed uprisings lingered in every subject world. But humans, new to the stage and fully aware of the risks, continued to resist with ferocity that defied logic. Each success, however small, was magnified in the eyes of the oppressed. The myth of imperial invincibility fractured, and in that fracture, the idea of possibility returned. On the human side, unity deepened. The early days of the conflict had been driven by necessity, but now there was pride in what they had achieved. The colonies no longer merely endured, they contributed actively to the advance. Factories churned out ships faster than projections suggested possible. Entire populations, once divided by politics or geography, merged into a collective effort. It was not blind nationalism but a shared conviction. They were defending the right to exist on their own terms. This conviction created an atmosphere the Empire could not replicate, for it was born not of fear or duty, but choice. Imperial leadership recognized the shift too late. Their assumption had always been that resistance was temporary, that fear would enforce obedience. Instead, their tactics bred determination. Terran victories, though still costly, carried outsized influence. By striking within imperial borders, humanity demonstrated that the war was no longer defensive. Raids hit supply depots, liberated prisoners, and shattered outposts deep inside enemy lines. For the first time in centuries, the Empire itself felt vulnerable. The adaptability of human command played a decisive role. Imperial officers, bound to hierarchy and protocol, hesitated when conditions changed. Terran leaders thrived on unpredictability, cultivating a culture where subordinates were encouraged to seize initiative. This flexibility allowed smaller fleets to maneuver with creativity, often turning battles by exploiting opportunities the Empire failed to recognize. Such victories accumulated not because of superior resources, but because of a mindset alien to imperial philosophy. More crucially, humanity refused to separate war from meaning. Each engagement was not merely a contest of fleets but a declaration of independence. Propaganda was unnecessary. The very act of survival carried its own message. Soldiers fought with the knowledge that their sacrifices fueled something greater, and civilians endured hardships knowing they were part of a struggle that transcended generations. This gave every loss context and every victory resonance, sustaining momentum that might otherwise have faltered. By the time Terran forces launched their first organized offensive into Imperial territory, the galaxy had shifted irreversibly. Humanity had proven not only that it could endure, but that it could seize the initiative. The Empire, for all its power, was forced into a defensive posture it had not occupied in centuries. Subject races watched intently, whispering of rebellion, while imperial governors scrambled to reassure populations whose loyalty was cracking. The war had ceased to be a one-sided exercise of dominance. It had become a contest of wills, and in such a contest the Empire found itself at a disadvantage. Humanity's capacity for resilience, innovation, and unity transformed the conflict from a desperate defense into a struggle for possibility. What the Empire had dismissed as defiance from an insignificant species had become something far greater, a movement that could not be ignored. The Empire's aura of inevitability shattered under the weight of its own arrogance. What began as a calculated display of dominance devolved into a struggle it could not contain. The Terran push into Imperial territory was not marked by sheer strength but by precision, audacity, and an unrelenting will that made every victory resonate far beyond its immediate effect. For centuries, no species had dared take the war to the Empire's doorstep. Humanity did so not out of hubris, but necessity. Each strike was chosen to inflict both material damage and psychological shock, unraveling the foundation of control that had seemed unshakable. Worlds long resigned to submission now witnessed something they had never thought possible. Terran fleets did not arrive as conquerors but as liberators, dismantling imperial outposts and offering freedom to those who had only known subjugation. Where the Empire's legions spread fear, humans extended defiance, and that difference transformed perception. Entire populations, once beaten into silence, began to believe rebellion could succeed. The Empire's vastness became a weakness, stretched thin by uprisings sparked by the very presence of Terran resistance. In battle, the final confrontations carried a weight far greater than strategy. Imperial commanders sought to crush the upstarts in decisive engagements, assembling fleets of overwhelming scale. Yet their very mass made them predictable, vulnerable to tactics that exploited rigidity. Terran forces, smaller and more agile, wove through their formations, disrupting coordination and striking where it mattered most. Victory was never assured, but determination replaced certainty, and that was enough to tilt the balance. Each clash chipped away at the myth of invulnerability until even the throne's most loyal officers began to doubt. The war reached its climax when Terran fleets penetrated deep into sectors once considered untouchable. The Empire's response was massive, mobilizing every resource to preserve its image of supremacy. But the very effort exposed how fragile that image had become. Coordinated rebellions erupted across dozens of systems, emboldened by Terran defiance. What had been a war against one species transformed into a crisis threatening the entire structure of imperial rule. Humanity had not only resisted, it had ignited a chain reaction across the galaxy. The final battles were brutal, costing Terrans dearly, yet the outcome was undeniable. The Empire's armadas, once symbols of unbreakable order, suffered defeats that could no longer be hidden. The throne, accustomed to commanding obedience through fear, found its authority corroding faster than fleets could be rebuilt. Human resilience had revealed the truth that power resting solely on intimidation collapses when faced with those willing to endure the cost of freedom. In the aftermath, the Terran Empire emerged not through conquest but through necessity. The galaxy no longer saw them as fledgling outsiders. They were recognized as a people who had challenged the most formidable power in existence and prevailed. Their authority did not rest on domination but on inspiration. Species that had cowered now turned to the Terrans, not as overlords, but as proof that resistance could succeed. The Empire's ultimatum, designed to end humanity's independence, had instead birthed a new center of gravity in galactic politics. The principles guiding this rise were simple but unyielding. Humanity would not govern by fear, for it understood the poison of chains too well. Instead, it offered alliance to the oppressed, partnership to the willing, and a promise that no power, no matter how ancient or vast, was beyond challenge. The very traits once mocked by the Empire, stubbornness, recklessness, defiance, had proven to be strengths, reshaping the galaxy's order. Looking back, the irony was inescapable. The ultimatum that sought to erase humanity had instead given it purpose. By threatening annihilation, the Empire had forged a unity and resolve no Terran leader could have summoned alone. By underestimating a species hardened by its own turbulent history, it had set in motion its own decline. Humanity had not only survived but transformed into a beacon for countless others. The war did not end with triumphant parades or declarations of absolute victory. It ended with a shift so profound that no future would resemble the past. The Galactic Empire still existed, but no longer as the sole authority. Terrans had taken their place not as subjects, but as equals, and in doing so had broken the monopoly of fear. The galaxy would never again look upon the throne with unquestioning obedience, because humanity had shown the universe a different way. That defiance, once lit, could not be extinguished. What began as an ultimatum concluded as reversal. The Empire had demanded submission and offered survival. Humanity answered with resistance and secured freedom. The throne's greatest mistake was believing fear was eternal, but history now bore a new truth. The Terrans had struck back, and in doing so, they had changed the destiny of the stars themselves.